Hey guys, welcome to Neighbor Stories with JusRead. Today we're diving into some incredible stories about overcoming the toughest neighbor disputes. Our story is titled, Turning a $500,000 eyesore into a community garden. The story starts like this. I never thought I'd become an accidental community organizer, but life has a funny way of pushing you into unexpected roles. My name's Mike, and up until a few years ago, I was just your average 35-year-old software developer living in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Portland. I kept to myself mostly, content with my small circle of friends and my modest ranch-style home with its postage stamp yard. That all changed the day old Mrs. Abernathy passed away. She'd lived in the big Victorian house at the end of Maple Street for as long as anyone could remember. It was a beautiful place once, all gingerbread trim and stained glass, with a sprawling yard full of rose bushes and fruit trees. But in her later years, as her health declined, the property fell into disrepair. By the time she died, it was definitely the eyesore of the neighborhood. I remember walking by it on my way to work each day, shaking my head at the peeling paint, overgrown lawn and sagging porch. The realtor's sign went up almost immediately after her death, proudly proclaiming $500,000, a real bargain. But months went by and no one bought it. The price kept dropping, but still no takers. It wasn't hard to see why. The place needed a ton of work, way more than most people would be willing to take on. And in our neighborhood of tidy ranches and Cape Cods, it stuck out like a sore thumb. Some of the more gossipy neighbors started whispering about how it was bringing down property values. I tried not to get involved at first. It wasn't my problem, right? But as summer turned to fall and the property continued to decay, I found myself getting more and more frustrated every time I walked by. It just seemed like such a waste. One Saturday morning in October, I was out for a jog when I saw a group of kids throwing rocks at the house's remaining windows. Without thinking, I shouted at them to stop. They scattered, but not before one of them yelled back, "What do you care, mister? It's just a stupid old dump anyway." I stood there for a moment, staring at the broken glass glittering on the ground. The kid was right. What did I care? But something about his words struck a chord in me. This house had been someone's home once. Mrs. Abernathy had raised her family here, hosted neighborhood parties in that overgrown backyard. It deserved better than to become target practice for bored teenagers. Before I knew what I was doing, I'd pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the realtor's sign. "Hi," I said when someone picked up. "I'm calling about the property on Maple Street. Is it still for sale?" The realtor, a chipper woman named Linda, sounded shocked that anyone was inquiring. "Oh yes," she exclaimed. "Are you interested in viewing it?" I hesitated for a split second before committing. "Actually, I'd like to make an offer." Looking back, I'm not sure what possessed me in that moment. I certainly wasn't in the market for a huge fixer-upper, but something about that house called to me. Maybe it was the untapped potential I saw beneath the decay, or maybe I was just sick of watching a piece of our neighborhood's history crumble away. Either way, less than a month later, I found myself the proud, and slightly terrified, owner of a dilapidated Victorian mansion. The final sale price had been a fraction of the original asking price. Apparently the bank was desperate to offload it. But even at $300,000, it felt like a massive, potentially foolish investment. My friends thought I'd lost my mind. "What are you going to do with that monstrosity?" my buddy Dave asked when I told him the news. I shrugged, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "Fix it up, I guess. Maybe rent it out eventually." But the truth was, I had no real plan. All I knew was that I couldn't stand to see the place torn down or left to rot any longer. The first few weeks of ownership were overwhelming. Every time I set foot in the house, I discovered new problems: rotting floorboards, outdated wiring, a leaky roof. The to-do list seemed endless. And that was just the interior. The yard was a whole other beast, a tangle of dead plants and debris that would take an army to clear. I threw myself into the work, spending every evening and weekend at the house. Slowly but surely, I started to make progress. I repaired what I could myself and called in professionals for the bigger jobs. It was expensive and exhausting, but there was something oddly satisfying about bringing the old place back to life. As I worked, curious neighbors would often stop by to see what was going on. At first their reactions were mixed. Some were excited to see the eyesore being fixed up. Others seemed skeptical that one person could make a difference. "You've sure taken on a big project there," Mr. Jenkins from across the street commented one day as he watched me painting the porch railings. "You really think you can turn this place around?" I wiped sweat from my forehead and gave him a determined smile. "I'm sure going to try." But it was Mrs. Castillo, my next-door neighbor, who really got me thinking. She'd wandered over one afternoon while I was taking a break in the overgrown backyard. "You know," she said, gesturing at the wild tangle of plants around us, "this would make a wonderful garden if it was cleared out. So much space. You could grow all sorts of things back here." I looked around with new eyes, trying to picture it. She was right. There was easily a quarter-acre of land back here, far more than I'd ever be able to use myself. An idea started to form in my mind. "What if," I said slowly, "what if it wasn't just my garden? What if it was a garden for the whole neighborhood?" Mrs. Castillo's eyes lit up. "Oh, that would be wonderful. We could grow vegetables, have flower beds, maybe even put in some benches where people could sit and enjoy the space." The more we talked, the more excited I became. This could be so much more than just fixing up an old house. This could be a way to bring the entire neighborhood together. The next day, I started putting up flyers around the area, inviting people to a community meeting at my house to discuss the idea of turning the backyard into a shared garden space. I wasn't sure what kind of turnout to expect, but to my surprise, nearly 30 people showed up that Saturday afternoon. As we all crowded into my living room, I laid out my vision. I know this property has been an eyesore for a long time, I began. But I think together, we can turn it into something beautiful that everyone can enjoy. I'm proposing we create a community garden in the backyard, a place where we can grow food, flowers, and friendships. There was a buzz of excitement in the room. People started calling out ideas: raised beds for vegetables, a butterfly garden, fruit trees, even a small playground for kids. It was clear that this was something the neighborhood had been craving without even realizing it. But not everyone was on board. Mr. Thompson, the self-appointed president of our informal neighborhood association, stood up with a frown. "This all sounds very nice," he said, "but who's going to pay for it? And what about liability issues? We can't just have people traipsing through private property whenever they feel like it." I'd anticipated these concerns. "I'm willing to cover the initial costs of setting up the garden," I explained. "As for ongoing expenses, I thought we could form a committee to handle that, maybe through donations or a small membership fee. And I've already talked to my insurance company about extending my coverage to include the garden space." Mr. Thompson didn't look convinced, but others jumped in to support the idea. By the end of the meeting, we had a rough plan in place and a core group of volunteers ready to help make it happen. Over the next few months, the transformation was incredible to watch. Every weekend, neighbors would show up with tools and plants, ready to work. We cleared out the overgrowth, tilled the soil, and started mapping out garden beds. One of our first big projects was building a fence around the property. We wanted the garden to be open and welcoming, but we also needed to define the space and provide some security. After much debate, we settled on a design that incorporated reclaimed wood from the house renovations, a beautiful blend of old and new that set the tone for the entire project. As word spread about what we were doing, local businesses started to get involved too. The hardware store donated tools and supplies. A landscaping company offered their services at a discounted rate to help with some of the heavier work. Even the city got on board, providing us with compost and mulch from their green waste program. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were disagreements about design choices, concerns about noise and traffic, and the ever-present worry about funding. Mr. Thompson continued to be a thorn in our side, showing up at every meeting with a new list of potential problems. "What happens when all these vegetables start attracting pests?" he demanded one day. "Or when people start fighting over who gets to harvest what? This whole thing is a disaster waiting to happen." I tried to address his concerns patiently, but I have to admit, there were times when I wanted to tell him to just buzz off. It was Mrs. Castillo who usually managed to smooth things over. "Change can be scary," she told him gently, "but sometimes we have to take a chance on something good. Why don't you come help us plant the tomatoes next week? You might find you enjoy it." To everyone's surprise, he actually showed up, and though he grumbled the whole time about proper planting techniques, I caught him smiling when he thought no one was looking. As spring turned to summer, the garden really started to take shape. We put in raised beds for vegetables, created a beautiful butterfly garden, and even managed to save a few of Mrs. Abernathy's old rose bushes. A local artist helped us design and paint a colorful mural on one of the fence panels, depicting the history of our neighborhood. One of my favorite additions was the reading nook we created in a shady corner of the yard. We built a small gazebo and filled it with donated books and comfortable chairs. It quickly became a popular spot for both kids and adults to relax and escape the summer heat. The house itself was coming along too. I'd finished most of the major repairs, and was now working on restoring some of its original Victorian charm. The porch, once sagging and dangerous, was now a welcoming space with rocking chairs and hanging plants. Inside, I'd kept as many original features as I could while updating the necessities like plumbing and electrical. As the garden flourished, so did our community. People who had lived on the same street for years but barely knew each other were now working side by side, swapping gardening tips and recipes. Kids who used to spend their summers glued to screens were now eagerly tending their own little plots of land. We started hosting regular events in the garden, potlucks, movie nights, even a small farmer's market where people could sell or trade their excess produce. The space that had once been an eyesore was now the heart of our neighborhood. One evening in late August, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set over the garden, Mrs. Castillo came over with a basket of tomatoes. "Just pick these," she said, setting them down beside me. "I thought you might like some." I thanked her, marveling at the bright red fruit. "I can't believe how well everything's grown," I said. "It's like magic." She smiled, settling into one of the rocking chairs. "Not magic," she said. "Just a lot of hard work and love. You know, when you first bought this place, I thought you were crazy. But now?" She gestured at the thriving garden, where a group of kids were chasing fireflies while their parents chatted nearby. "Now I think it might be the best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood." I nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer evening. I never could have done it alone, I said. This is everyone's achievement. As if on cue, Mr. Thompson appeared at the gate, looking slightly sheepish. Evening, he called out. I just wanted to say, well, I may have been wrong about this whole garden idea. It's turned out pretty nice. I tried to hide my shock at this admission. Thanks, Mr. Thompson. We're glad you're part of it. He nodded gruffly. Well, I was wondering, do you think there might be room for a beehive or two? I used to keep bees years ago, and I thought it might be good for the garden. I grinned, already imagining the possibilities. I think that's a great idea. Why don't you come to our next committee meeting and we can discuss it? As Mr. Thompson wandered off to inspect the tomato plants, Mrs. Castillo chuckled. Will wonders never cease? She said. You've not only transformed a house, you've transformed people too. I looked out at the garden, glowing in the golden light of sunset. Children laughed as they played hide and seek among the tall sunflowers. A group of neighbors sat chatting on the benches we'd built, sharing a plate of cookies. In one corner, an elderly man was patiently teaching a young girl how to prune a rosebush. This was so much more than I'd ever envisioned when I impulsively bought that rundown old house. What had started as a simple desire to fix up an eyesore had blossomed into something truly special. We'd created not just a garden, but a living, growing community. As the fireflies began to twinkle in the deepening twilight, I felt a profound sense of contentment wash over me. This garden, this community, it was home in the truest sense of the word. And as I looked at the now beautiful Victorian house behind me, I knew that somewhere, old Mrs. Abernathy was smiling down on us all. The success of our community garden didn't go unnoticed. As word spread about what we'd accomplished, we started getting visitors from other neighborhoods, even from other cities. People wanted to know how we'd done it, how we'd turned a neglected property into a thriving community space. I found myself giving impromptu tours, explaining our composting system or showing off our rainwater collection setup. It was a bit overwhelming at times, but also incredibly rewarding to see how our little project was inspiring others. One day, a reporter from the local newspaper showed up, wanting to do a feature story on the garden. As we walked through the lush paths, her eyes wide with wonder, she asked me what I thought was the key to our success. I had to think about it for a moment. I guess, I said slowly, it's that we made this a true community effort from the very beginning. This isn't my garden that I'm letting others use. It's our garden that we all built together. She nodded, scribbling in her notebook. And what would you say to other communities who might want to try something similar? I chuckled. Be prepared for a lot of hard work, I said. And don't expect everything to go smoothly all the time. But also, don't be afraid to dream big. You might be surprised at what your community can accomplish when everyone works together. The article came out the following week, complete with beautiful photos of the garden in full bloom. The response was overwhelming. We started getting calls and emails from people all over the state, asking for advice on starting their own community gardens. It was around this time that I realized we had an opportunity, and maybe even a responsibility, to do more. After discussing it with the garden committee, we decided to start offering workshops and classes on various aspects of gardening and community organizing. We held sessions on everything from basic vegetable growing to advanced permaculture techniques. I taught a class on home renovation, sharing what I'd learned from fixing up the old Victorian. Mrs. Castillo, who turned out to have a wealth of knowledge about native plants, led wildflower walks. Even Mr. Thompson got involved, starting a popular beekeeping course once we'd successfully installed those hives he'd suggested. As our programs grew, we realized we needed more space. That's when I had another crazy idea. Why not use the house itself? We could turn the first floor into a community center, I proposed at our next meeting. We've got plenty of room for classrooms, a small library, maybe even a kitchen for cooking classes using food from the garden. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and soon we were embarking on another renovation project. This time, though, I had plenty of help. Neighbors pitched in with painting and decorating, local businesses donated furniture and supplies, and a grant from a community development fund helped cover the major costs. By the following spring, the Maple Street Community Center was open for business. The old parlor, with its restored hardwood floors and large windows, made a perfect classroom space. We converted the formal dining room into a cozy library filled with books on gardening, sustainability, and community building. The kitchen, once dark and outdated, was now a bright, welcoming space where people gathered to learn about healthy cooking and food preservation. We even set up a small office upstairs where people could come for advice on starting their own community projects. I found myself spending more and more time there, helping others navigate the challenges we'd faced and overcome. It wasn't always easy balancing my regular job with my growing responsibilities at the center. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, wondering if I'd bitten off more than I could chew. But every time I started to doubt myself, something would happen to remind me why it was all worth it. Like the day I overheard two elderly neighbors, who'd previously barely spoken to each other, laughing together as they tended their shared plot in the garden. Or when a shy teenager told me that working in the garden had helped her overcome her social anxiety. Or the time a family who'd been struggling financially tearfully thanked us for the fresh produce that had made such a difference in their lives. These moments kept me going, even on the toughest days. And as time went on, I found that the more I gave to the community, the more I received in return. My circle of friends had expanded exponentially. I had a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. And although I was busier than ever, I felt more fulfilled and happier than I'd been in years. Of course, we still faced challenges. Funding was an ongoing concern, especially as our programs expanded. We applied for grants, held fundraisers, and even started a small CSA, community-supported agriculture, program to help cover costs. It was a constant juggling act, but somehow we always managed to make ends meet. There were other issues too. As the garden became more popular, we had to figure out how to manage increased foot traffic without disturbing the neighbors. Parking became a problem on days when we held larger events, and there were occasional disagreements among members about everything from plant choices to volunteer schedules. But for every problem we encountered, we found a solution, together. That was the beauty of what we'd created. It wasn't just a garden or a community center. It was a network of people who cared about each other and their shared space. As our third summer approached, we decided to host a big neighborhood festival to celebrate how far we'd come. We planned games for the kids, live music, food made with produce from the garden, and tours of both the garden and the community center. The day of the festival dawned bright and clear. As I stood on the porch of the old Victorian, now beautifully restored and serving as a beacon of community spirit, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at what we'd accomplished. The once overgrown yard was now a lush oasis, bursting with colorful flowers, thriving vegetable plots, and winding paths. Children ran laughing through the butterfly garden, chasing each other around the gazebo. The air was filled with the buzz of bees from Mr. Thompson's hives, and the cheerful chatter of neighbors catching up with one another. Inside the house, now our bustling community center, volunteers were setting up displays showcasing our various programs and classes. The kitchen was a hive of activity as people prepared for the cooking demonstrations scheduled throughout the day. As the festival got underway, I found myself constantly amazed by the sense of community that surrounded me. People who 3 years ago might have barely nodded to each other on the street were now embracing like old friends. Kids who once would have been glued to their devices were eagerly showing off the vegetables they'd grown. Even Mr. Thompson, once our biggest critic, was in his element. He'd set up a booth to talk about beekeeping, and was drawing quite a crowd with his enthusiastic explanations and honey tasting. Midway through the afternoon, Mrs. Castillo found me near the lemonade stand. "Can you believe all this?" she asked, gesturing at the happy crowd around us. "Remember when this was just a crazy idea we cooked up in that overgrown backyard?" I shook my head, smiling. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself," I admitted. "It's more than I ever dreamed it could be." She squeezed my arm affectionately. "You should be proud, Mike. None of this would have happened without you." But I knew that wasn't entirely true. "It's not just me," I said. "Everyone here made this happen. We all did this together." As the day wore on and the festival wound down, I found myself back on the porch, watching the sunset just as I had that evening with Mrs. Castillo 2 summers ago. But this time, I wasn't alone. The porch was filled with neighbors, all of us basking in the warm glow of a successful day and a thriving community. Someone started strumming a guitar, and soon a gentle song floated out over the garden. I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, my friends, illuminated by the soft lighting we'd strung up for the festival. There was a contentment, a sense of belonging, that I'd never seen before in our neighborhood. In that moment, I realized that we'd created something truly special here. What had started as one person's impulsive decision to buy a rundown old house had blossomed into a movement that had transformed not just a piece of property, but an entire community. The $500,000 eyesore that no one wanted had become priceless, not in terms of money, but in the connections it had fostered, the lives it had touched, and the sense of purpose it had given to so many people. As the last notes of the song faded away, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets and the soft murmur of conversation, I felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. Gratitude for this place, for these people, and for the unexpected journey that had led me here. I thought back to that October morning when I'd impulsively called the realtor, having no idea where that decision would lead. If I could go back in time and tell my past self what would come of that moment, would I have believed it? Probably not. But standing here now, surrounded by the fruits of our collective labor and the warmth of true community, I knew I wouldn't change a thing. This garden, this community center, this neighborhood, it was home in the deepest sense of the word. And as I looked out over the thriving garden that had once been a neglected eyesore, I knew that the real growth wasn't just in the plants we'd nurtured, but in the connections we'd formed and the community we'd built together. The festival marked a turning point for our community. It wasn't just a celebration of what we'd accomplished, it was a springboard for even greater things to come. In the weeks and months that followed, we saw a surge of interest in our programs and a flood of new ideas from community members. One of the most exciting developments came from an unexpected source. "Remember Dave, my friend who thought I was crazy for buying the old house? Well, he showed up at the community center one day with a proposal. I've been thinking," he said, a bit nervously. "You know that vacant lot on Oak Street? The one that's been sitting empty for years? What if we did something like this there?" I grinned, already seeing where he was going with this. You mean turn it into another community garden? He nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. I mean, it wouldn't be as big as this one, but I bet we could still do a lot with it. And I'd be willing to spearhead the project if you'd be willing to advise. I was touched by his offer and excited by the possibility. I think that's a fantastic idea, Dave. Let's bring it up at the next community meeting and see what everyone thinks. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Within a month, we had a new committee formed and plans underway for our second community garden. It was amazing to see how much easier it was this time around. We had experience, resources, and most importantly, a community that was ready and eager to pitch in. As work began on the new garden, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in just a few short years. Our neighborhood, once a collection of isolated households, had become a true community. People looked out for each other, supported one another, and worked together towards common goals. The impact went beyond just our immediate area too. Our success had inspired similar projects in other parts of the city. I found myself being invited to speak at community events and local government meetings, sharing our story and offering advice to others who wanted to start their own initiatives. One particularly memorable moment came when the mayor visited our community center. She toured the garden, sat in on a cooking class, and then addressed a gathering of community members. "What you've created here is truly remarkable," she said, her eyes shining with genuine admiration. "You've shown what's possible when people come together with a common purpose. Your work here is a model for what we hope to see throughout our city." Her words filled me with pride, not for myself, but for everyone who had contributed to making our vision a reality. As I looked around at the familiar faces of my neighbors, I saw that same pride reflected in their eyes. After the mayor's visit, things really started to take off. We received a significant grant from the city to expand our programs, allowing us to hire a small staff to help manage the growing workload. We partnered with the local school district to develop gardening and nutrition programs for kids. We even started a small business incubator, helping community members turn their gardening hobbies into sustainable enterprises. As our influence grew, I found myself spending more and more time on community projects. Eventually, I made the decision to leave my software job and focus full-time on managing the community center and garden. It was a scary leap, but it felt right. This work had become my passion, my purpose. Now, 5 years after I first bought that rundown old Victorian, our neighborhood is unrecognizable, in the best possible way. The community garden has expanded to cover several lots, creating a green oasis in the heart of our suburb. The community center is a hub of activities 7 days a week, offering classes, workshops, and a gathering place for people of all ages. But the most significant change isn't visible on any map. It's in the way people interact, the sense of belonging that permeates our neighborhood. It's in the smiles exchanged between neighbors, the helping hands extended without hesitation, the shared pride in our collective achievements. As for the old Victorian house that started it all, it stands proudly at the center of our community. Its restored beauty a testament to what can be accomplished when people come together with a shared vision. The porch where I once sat alone, contemplating an uncertain future, is now a favorite gathering spot for neighbors to chat, laugh, and plan our next big project. Looking back, I'm amazed at how one impulsive decision led to such profound changes, not just in my life, but in the lives of so many others. That $500,000 eyesore, once a symbol of neglect and decay, has become the heart of a thriving, connected community. As I sit on that porch now, watching new generations of children play in the garden their parents helped create, I'm filled with a deep sense of contentment. We've built something here that's far more valuable than any real estate investment. We've built a true community, and that, I've learned, is the most rewarding investment of all. And guys, with this we have reached the end of the video. If you enjoyed this epic neighbor showdown, please smash that like button, comment with some house emojis to show your support, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks a lot, and I will see you again tomorrow with another amazing story.